Well, Attorney Warren Alperstein is on the phone with us right now. Warren's been with us throughout this trial to talk us through the events in the courtroom, and I know you've been in the courtroom for much of the proceedings. So now we have a mistrial, a lot of speculation about what happens next. We're continuing to watch on our screen right now as we see some activity in the streets there around the courthouse. But Warren, we're going to bring you into the conversation, and what's next?
Well, good afternoon. Good to be with you. So I was there today, and you know, as you know, and as your viewers now know, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on any of the 4 counts. And so what Judge Williams ultimately instructed the attorneys for both the prosecution
Warren,
and the defense.
Warren, I hate to interrupt you. We've got to get to our Keith Daniels. There's some action at the courthouse. Keith, what's happening? We had Attorney Warren Alperstein on the phone with us. Warren, are you back with us now?
I am. I'm here.
Okay. So sorry to interrupt you earlier, but, you know, you can look at a mistrial in a way as being a draw, but it's not really a draw, is it? Because it's problematic for the prosecution going forward.
Yeah, I believe it will be very problematic for the prosecution because, remember, Officer Goodson is the driver of the transport wagon. And Officer Porter has made various statements, both two that we know of to investigators early on, as well as he testified. And collectively, all those statements, he shifted the blame to Officer Goodson. The state has made it abundantly clear that it wants to use Officer Porter as a witness in its prosecution against Goodson. If Officer Porter is pending trial because the state chooses to retry him, and he's in a status where he is pending trial when called as a witness against Goodson, Officer Porter, will have a Fifth Amendment privilege to not testify. In other words, the Constitution says you don't have to testify against yourself if you can incriminate yourself. So that presents a problem for the prosecution in calling Porter in the case against Goodson.
Yeah, and Warren, let's say in theory, let's say somehow or another that the prosecution decides, you know what, we need to move on with Officer Goodson if the state believes they indeed have a stronger case against him than they have against Porter. In terms of Porter, whether or not he's offered immunity, people have been asking the question about his future at the police department. That's not a slam dunk, even if he's not retried. He still has to go through an administrative review department with the police department. Is that not correct?
Yeah, well, he would, and I don't anticipate any, review or what we call trial boards or anything along those lines would occur for many, many months, if not years, because all of these cases have to be adjudicated and finished before that's going to occur. That being said, we go back to, what does the state do? Does the state, prosecute Porter again? I would anticipate the state will, when it appears tomorrow morning in administrative court, try to select a new trial date for Officer Porter. It will try to, get a trial date before January 6th. I don't anticipate that happening under any circumstances.
Right.
And then you have Officer Goodson, who's scheduled for trial on January 6th, which leaves the state in the unenviable position of having to decide what to do in the prosecution of Officer Goodson without the ability to use Porter in its case.
Can they ask for a delay in the case of Goodson?
They could ask for a delay, but, then the defense attorneys for not only Goodson, but the other then 4 officers sitting as defendants will absolutely, without a doubt, object. They will argue it is not fair to our clients to have our cases moved just so that the state can be accommodated in trying Officer Porter before Officer Goodson again. And so I wouldn't expect the court here in Baltimore City or any judge sitting as the presiding judge to, go to that extent to appease the state. I would be surprised if that would occur.
Yeah.
All right, and just to orient our viewers,
Yeah.
Warren, we're looking on the left side of our screen and Joy LaPola on the right side, but protesters have now made their way in front of City Hall, down the street from the courthouse, and our Joy LaPola is now outside of City Hall, and you can see there is a strong tactical presence there as well. Hi, Joy. And welcome back to our special coverage this afternoon on Fox 45 News at 5. We're continuing to follow the developments out of the courthouse today. A mistrial declared in the trial of Officer William Porter. Joining us now, Attorney Warren Alperstein. Thanks for coming back in and talking with us. We've had you on the phone already this afternoon, but thanks for making it in
Good to
person.
be with you guys.
Yeah.
All
We
right,
appreciate
so
you being here.
what do you make of this, and what does it mean going forward?
Well, we know obviously that there was the mistrial declared. We know that Judge Williams ordered both the state and the defense to appear tomorrow morning in administrative court. It's a procedural hearing. Simply what's going to happen is they're going to select a new trial date. What's not clear is what happens to the other 5 trials, specifically what happens to Officer Goodson's trial, which we know is scheduled for January the 6th. We know that the prosecution very much wants to use Officer Porter to testify for the state against Officer Goodson. That becomes a problem in many respects for the prosecution, because Officer Porter, as long as he's pending a retrial, will very much have his right to remain silent as guaranteed, by the Constitution. So it's going to be difficult to compel him to testify against Goodson, and ultimately, at the end of the day, it may make it difficult for the state to prove certain aspects of the case that it needs to against Goodson.
Give us an idea of what's likely happening from the state's perspective. As we imagine, Mrs. Mosby and her team will be meeting late tonight to try and figure out some strategy for this administrative hearing tomorrow. What options do they have at their disposal at this point, Warren?
Well, I expect them to, recognizing first of all that tomorrow is a scheduling hearing simply and only for Officer Porter. Goodson or neither Goodson nor any of the other officers will be there tomorrow morning. So because of that, it'll be limited just to a new date for Officer Porter. In the weeks to come, the state may very well attempt to postpone Goodson's case, but I would expect that Officer Goodson's attorneys will very much object to any delay in Goodson's trial, because at the end of the day, what that request is doing in effect is the state saying, hey, please accommodate our wishes to keep...
To strengthen our case against him.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So can they offer Officer Porter immunity to testify against Goodson now?
They could. I think the state believes, the prosecution believes, that Officer Goodson, is the bigger fish. He's the bigger prize in all of this. He was the driver of the wagon. And the charges against Officer Goodson are certainly more serious than they were against Porter. So I think we could all conclude that. That being said, yes, the state has to make a decision. Do we try it again against Porter, knowing that Porter may be tried at the end of the first now 5, or the other 5, we'll say.
Right.
But the state, they have the big decisions to make.
Yeah, and in fact, I was going to say one of your legal colleagues, Warren Brown, someone with whom you're very familiar.
Sure.
Jennifer and I heard him say this becomes problematic for the state. They called Officer Porter a liar during this process. And how can you have someone then testify against Officer Goodson, who you've labeled a liar?
That's a good point, Kai, because at the end of the day, the prosecution attacks, Officer Porter's credibility. They exposed what the prosecution believes were inconsistencies between his trial testimony and the previous statements that Porter made to investigative detectives in the police department. So how does the prosecution then reconcile those inconsistencies when they're ultimately trying to present Officer Porter as a credible witness in the case against Goodson?
And just really quickly, we have time for one more question, but if you're Officer Porter, do you have the choice of whether to accept immunity, or is it beneficial to wait and see how another case would play out? From a defense perspective, what's the strategy there?
Well, what would happen is the prosecution team would approach Officer Porter's attorneys and say, excuse me, would say, we're willing to proceed in a certain way, be it a plea to a less serious charge. Officer Porter may say, no, I'm not doing that because I want to continue to be a police officer. Or the prosecution team could approach the attorneys and say, why don't we, we're going to dismiss the case, and then we're going to compel him to testify. And if they do that, he would be compelled to testify. He could have a privilege under the sort of federal system as well, because the Department of Justice, U.S. Attorney's Office may very well be investigating him and the other officers for civil rights violations. So that's another angle to look at.
All right, Warren
Warren,
Alperstein,
thank
as
you.
always, thanks for coming in.
You bet.